Okay. Okay. There were two, based on the council's focus areas, and there were really two committees that were formed. One was an assured water supply committee. The other was rural groundwater management. I was leading the rural groundwater management. The objective of those two committees, first, the assured water supply committee also focused on groundwater, also focused on resiliency, also focused on a lot of certainty, but essentially it was based on strengthening the integrity of the assured water supply, protect consumers and aquifer, and ensure future growth is not reliant solely on mined groundwater. And for those of you that have been following this issue associated with the assured water supply program, the department ran a groundwater model this past year and a half ago. And essentially in that groundwater model, there were indicators that essentially there was unmet demand, and essentially there were areas in which there wasn't groundwater to meet future growth. And so the department put a delay on issuing any more groundwater certificates. Now, there are plenty of certificates out there where there's still growth in which they need to grow into those certificates and utilize water, including designations by many water providers in the cities. But it put a kibosh on essentially a delay on issuing any more certificates until they could come up with an alternative program or alternative means in which we could move forward and at the same time not put the aquifer at risk. And so that would be a separate presentation in and of itself. There has been an alternative designation process that has been developed, and that some of the providers are contemplating utilizing that alternative method. And there continues to be ongoing work working together with providers in the valley, in particular within the Phoenix AMA, to find other alternatives in which they can move forward and continue to grow. But next slide, please. We're going to focus on rural Arizona, but I just thought I'd give you a quick update on that. The objective of the rural groundwater management was to essentially focus on rural communities, assist those rural communities to manage local groundwater resources, protect water users, and sustainably manage those aquifers. Something that was very important, ongoing, associated with these aquifers and associated with rural Arizona is that the groundwater basin management needs really needed to be tailored or customized to the basin's unique characteristics, whether it's the hydrogeology or whether it is the end uses and the type of uses within those basins. There was rural groundwater reform legislation that was proposed based off of the recommendations that came from the Rural Groundwater Management Committee. Now, the Rural Groundwater Management Committee was consisted of like 15, 16 different individuals that represented a cross-functional group of water users, from industrial to municipal to agriculture to NGOs. We also had representation from academic world, and then there was also rural representation and urban representation. We only had 1 year. The governor gave us less than a year, essentially, to come up with recommendations, and so the department was very, very aggressive in getting these groups to come up with some alternatives that we could make as recommendations to the governor. For those of you that have been around a bit, and if you've ever served on one of these councils, they typically don't make recommendations that quickly, and many times those recommendations don't go anywhere. And so the big push here by the department and by the governor is that she wanted something that was actionable, because if she can't find something that's actionable, the department will take action. And the department does have the authority to take action through these AMAs and INAs. So we came up with this alternative method for rural Arizona regarding creating rural groundwater management areas. And essentially that was outlined in this legislation. Again, if you look at this map, you can see that throughout Arizona, we have groundwater basins where you're seeing declines when it comes to groundwater use. Some are more significant than others, and those that are more significant are those that are in red. The legislation that was drafted was House Bill 2857. There was an alternative piece of legislation that was drafted by another group, which is Senate Bill 1221. Senate Bill 1221 was heard. House Bill 2857 was not. But I can tell you that we're right now under negotiations to see if we can come up with an alternative that includes part of the focus of 2857 together with some of the elements that are in 1221. We have a meeting right after this. I have to head down to the Capitol to talk with the Republican leadership on maybe a potential alternative that we might introduce, but we'll see how that plays out. Next slide, please. Department of Water Resources. I thought I'd put some indication of the situation and the type of data that DWR has and how we got to this point. DWR has over 1,700 wells across the state in which considered index wells, where we take measurements when it comes to aquifer levels, etc. I can tell you that some of we're losing more and more access to these wells. One of the challenges that we're having is some people, it seems like organizations, groups aren't as willing anymore to allow access by department personnel to wells in rural Arizona. I think it's there's just some suspicion associated with what we're up to. I can tell you that the department, one of our goals is to get a better understanding of what's happening on a more, I would say, a much broader basis within these basins and when it comes to aquifer levels. And so, if you look at where these index wells are located, many of them are located in the AMAs and INAs where you have a lot of information. You kind of know what's happening within those basins, but you can see that they're kind of thin and spread out in rural Arizona. And so one of the components of moving forward with any rural groundwater management scheme is that the department's going to have to get additional index wells or monitoring wells throughout these rural groundwater basins. Next slide, please. Our hydrologist did some analysis based off the data that we do have, and this is data. You're going to see a few maps between 2000, the year 2000 and 2020 regarding groundwater conditions. I'm assuming you're all familiar with these box and whisker plots, but essentially what you're seeing is water level change in various groundwater basins here in Southwest Arizona. And as you see on the map too, we've also mapped areas of subsidence, land subsidence. Land subsidence is one of the indicators that the director can use in establishing an AMA or an INA. And that will also be an indicator when it comes to establishing potentially an RGMA, because as you know, subsidence is an indicator that your aquifer levels are essentially dropping. But you can see those aquifers that are experiencing the greatest drop, in particular, the Gila Bend Basin. But then you have a Harquahala Basin. And Harquahala Basin is really designed to drop. We won't go into a lot of details associated with that, but the Harquahala Basin is covered by an INA. And an INA essentially limits agricultural production, but it doesn't limit how much water you can pump out of the aquifer. And so an INA doesn't necessarily manage the aquifer itself. What it does, it just closes the basin from any further development. Next slide, please. Here are some basins in southeastern Arizona. You can see that those that are experiencing, some of the highest rates of aquifer depletion in particular is the Wilcox Basin. The Wilcox Basin a couple of years ago had a vote on AMA and it was defeated. But I can tell you that the Wilcox area residents are very, very interested in some sort of rural groundwater management scheme. They understand that the rate of depletion is not sustainable, and that they've seen wells drying up, in particular domestic wells drying up throughout the Wilcox Basin. There's been a substantial expansion of agricultural users within the Wilcox Basin, and they have the right to do that. But I think the users within Wilcox have a better understanding that there has to be some limits, and they need some sort of framework in place to address the significant depletion rate that they're witnessing within the Wilcox Basin. Next slide, please. And then the active management areas. And you can see the active management areas from a groundwater aquifer depletion perspective are in pretty good shape. Much of this has to do with the introduction of Colorado River water. When you think about these rural subbasins and these rural groundwater basins, they don't have alternative water supplies. Where here in these major AMAs, we have the Colorado River, and then of course the Salt River Project and the Phoenix AMA. So they have alternative renewable water supplies, or at least access to alternative renewable water supplies. You just don't have that in these rural groundwater basins. It's essentially the aquifer that you're depending upon, and any limited natural recharge that you may receive. There was a new AMA that was created in Douglas, the Douglas AMA, if those of you that aren't familiar with that, and the department is going through right now the verification process with certificates. It was an INA, and they voted to create an AMA within Douglas. Next slide, please. So there were several priority basins that were identified by the Rural Groundwater Committee, and those were the Gila Bend Basin, Renegris Plain Basin, and Wilcox Basin. And from the perspective of everyone on the committee, these would be the first three basins where we would want to initiate some sort of rural groundwater management. Next slide. As I mentioned, the House Bill 2857 was crafted to be consistent with the recommendations. The legislation remains flexible. It's really locally driven, where there would be and I'll go through some of the details and some of the other slides, but it's a collaborative effort between local water users and the Department of Water Resources. Conservation is key. You know, you're going to have to cut back on water use within the basin, but want to work together with the locals on, unique opportunities in which they can do that. Another key component is closing the basin to any further development. I can tell you too that the rural groundwater management focus is more focused on the straw in the ground or the well, and not so focused as they are in the AMAs on, like a certificated irrigation land area, and limiting that land area. That isn't necessarily the focus of these rural groundwater management areas. It's more focused on, how much water you're pumping out of the well. We worked with the governor's office to draft some legislation, and we had two sponsors, Representative Mathis and Senator Sundaration, that essentially introduced 2857. Next slide. Here are some of the unique attributes and key elements associated with these rural groundwater management areas. Like I said, customizable, one size fits all approach just doesn't work. Locally driven to address local water management programs. Users need certainty. And so there would be a certificated program where end users would be certificated with a water right associated with the type of use. It needs to be flexible, but you have to have effective conservation. So there has to be some level of cutback in water use. Periodic reviews. This is something that was important. If conditions change, or if there's some major new technology that comes into place, every 10 years, is there an opportunity to review the management plan, review the goal that you set for the basin, and maybe you adapt the goal, or maybe you sunset potentially one of these basins for rural groundwater management if they are meeting their goals and they are sustainably managing that aquifer. This would be focused only on non-exempt wells, but you would be required to measure and report. That's another concern throughout rural Arizona. There aren't mandatory measurement requirements or reporting requirements associated with groundwater users in rural Arizona. There would be oversight through a goal and a management plan. There would also be requirements in place similar to the AMAs when it comes to new wells, and that may be drilled or replacement wells. And then there would also be a funding mechanism established in the state to help fund some of these rural groundwater management area programs. Next slide. So how will it be created? And here's some of the issues where we had some conflict between Senate Bill 1221 and House Bill 2857. Senate Bill 1221 was focused on elections and a 100% support by County Board of Supervisors, versus 2857, resembled and was a little bit closer to how you may create an AMA or an INA. But essentially, the initiation of RGMA could be initiated by the director, and by the director, it'd have to meet some of the criteria that's off to the right there in the blue box. It could be initiated by a petition, 10% of the basin voters, and then that petition would be evaluated by the director if it met this criteria, or a resolution by the County Board of Supervisors. And the criteria that we had developed was water management is needed currently to preserve or current future water supply. In other words, you're seeing a significant drop in aquifer. Land subsidence or fisheries occurring, or the use of groundwater is threatening water quality, which is impacting your ability to utilize that water effectively. Next slide, please. If the director designates a rural groundwater management area, these certificates of groundwater use would be based off of a 10-year historical average. One of the things that we've been working on, if you look at over 10 years, a lot of these farmers rotate crops or take fields out of production or may fallow those fields, or you have new users that have came into these basins that maybe they only have 5 years, 5 years of use. And so the thought is those years where you have zero use, that you'd take those out, because essentially you may have some users. Let's say you have a new user that came into the basin and they've only used water in the last 2 years. Essentially, they'd be cut 80%, right? Because you'd have 8 years of zero water use. And so we're working through that and trying to figure out, what makes sense. And then you'd have this flexibility to move, sell, or lease, or retire your water right. And so anytime you would do that, essentially what we're doing is that we're enabling these certificated users, in particular the ag users, since many of these basins, their large users are ag users, essentially monetizing, their right. And if there's an opportunity for someone that might want to expand their farm, they're going to have to go out and work with another farmer, and perhaps that farmer is growing alfalfa. And let's say it's on 100 acres. He takes 10 acres out of production. He sells it to another farmer. And let's say that farmer is growing grapes. Well, grapes use about 1/5 of the water that you use for alfalfa. So there's a 15% cut to the aquifer. And now this grape user, maybe he could put in 20 acres of vineyards, but the overall water usage within the basin is less than it was had this transaction not taken place. You can't do this in the AMA, and you can't do this in the INA. So it's kind of a creative mechanism to incent some of those agricultural users to get creative and not place too many restrictions on those rural economies, so that they can, kind of work together with one another to distinguish how do we best conserve this water, and if there are opportunities to grow new crops or do some different things, that there is some flexibility for them to do that. There would be an advisory council made up of local water stakeholders and water users that would be appointed. They would select a management goal and then develop a water management plan, and all of that would be essentially in collaboration with the Department of Water Resources and ultimately approved by the director. Next slide. There would be a 7-member, and we've really narrowed that down now to a 5-member. I can tell you that as part of the negotiations, but it would represent all the major groundwater use sectors within these rural areas. In Senate Bill 2857, and this is something that's under negotiation right now, on who does the appointments and when, and what does that look like. But under Senate Bill 2857, 3 of the appointments would come from the governor, 1 would come from the Senate president, 1 from the House Speaker, 1 from the Senate Minority Leader, and 1 from the House Minority Leader. And all of these potential council members would be nominated by local water stakeholder groups like cities, councils, political subdivisions, federal agencies, Indian tribes. Indian tribes were involved in the Rural Groundwater Management Committee. And so Indian tribes, conservation districts, water providers, irrigation districts, ditch companies, or even local legislators. Next slide. And then they'd set this management goal. And really the management goal, similar to the AMAs, it kind of guides your management plan. And so the goal may be just reducing the rate of groundwater depletion. Notice that safe yield is up here. I don't think any of these basins could ever reach safe yield just because of the situation that they just don't have an alternative renewable water supply coming into the basin. But I think there are opportunities for them to reduce the rate of aquifer depletion, extend the life of that aquifer, and continue to work on alternative programs in which they can remain in business and try to be as resilient as they can. Opportunities maybe to develop some additional recharge, maybe reuse, but I don't think safe yield is a realistic goal. And then developing a management plan to support the management goal. The objective for the first 10 years is at least a reduction of 10% within 10 years. So that would be the focus. You have to reduce at least 10% of water use within that basin. I think many of those basins can easily meet that goal and could probably do 20%. But we didn't want to be too restrictive, want to make it more of a local, locally driven management plans. In the similar fashion, I've been in the water business for 40 years, and I worked on the AMAs, did some of the initial verification of the grandfather water rights within the Phoenix AMA. And I can tell you there was a lot of pushback in the first 10 years and maybe even for the next management plan. But overall, I think now within the AMAs, people have adapted and really appreciate that certainty associated with having that groundwater management plan in place, having conservation goals in place, having assured water supply program in place so that they know that there's a long-term reliable supply of water. And I think that same sort of philosophy will, eventually occur within these rural areas once the locals have the opportunity to work through this and they have some experience. But that's just Bruce talking. Next slide, please. I went through that fairly quickly. I can tell you that the department did initiate a informal discussion in Gila Bend in regard to potentially creating an AMA. There's no formal process. We did reach out to the Gila Bend, many of the Gila Bend water users for their input and thoughts on creating an AMA. We received over 50 public comments and input, and we're looking at that input, looking at that information, and going to utilize that to make a decision whether to initiate formal discussions and the formal process in creating an AMA for Gila Bend, or potentially, this RGMA, a rural groundwater management area, may be more of a better program for the Gila Bend Basin. So I thought I'd give you an update there. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we continue discussions on potential legislation to be introduced this year, and type of legislation that requires some conservation management goals in place, creation of the RGMA is such that it's not too onerous, and something that the governor can support. And we'll see if we can come up with a negotiated position with some of the Republican leadership. If not, we'll continue moving forward with this next year, or potentially the department could move forward with the existing authorities it has today to create an AMA or an INA. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over for any questions. If there are any questions you might have, I don't even know if I exceeded my time, Jacob, or if there's plenty of time left.
No, there's plenty of time for questions. So just a reminder, anybody, if you have those, you can put those in the chat and we'll get those out to Bruce here. So I'll just start it off. This is great, Bruce. Appreciate it. It's really great to see what's being done. Thus far, my experience or exposure to this is mainly being what's on the news. But one of the things that I wanted to ask is you mentioned how there was resistance or whatever to having the state there measuring wells, the index wells. Is there, I guess, what's being done, or is there anything being done to try and improve the perception or of what the state's trying to accomplish with this?
I think there's some concern that, people feel as if water and the water use that they're using in rural Arizona, that it's private information and that it may be used against them in a lawsuit. As you know, there was the Fondamonte issue, and now that was on state land, so that's a tad bit different. But the perspective from many of those rural users is, here the state's coming after this irrigation user, alfalfa user. What's to stop them from coming after me? And so I think there's kind of that suspicion level that's increased. So we're trying to do what we can to educate more thoroughly that we're here to work together with those end users. I think another item that people don't understand is that groundwater is a public resource. It's not a private resource. It's not something that you own. Now, you do have the ability to pump that water. But when that groundwater that's underground is essentially a public resource where the Department of Water Resources has the authority to manage that public resource on behalf of the state. And so I think there's a perception out there that those individuals that own land, that they own that water, that's their water. Well, it's not. It's not their water until they bring it to the surface. And so there's this obligation that the state has in managing that public resource, whether end users like that or not. And so I think that's another issue that we need to better educate. And I think we need to do a much, much better job in building relationships with some of those rural water users. And I think through this RGMA effort, and we've gone out and talked to many of the rural areas, I can tell you that most of those rural farmers understand that, yeah, we need some water management out here. We've seen wells go dry. We've seen some of our neighbors' wells go dry. The last thing we want to do is, continue to deplete this aquifer at a rate that's not sustainable for my grandkids or even, future generations. And so I think they're looking for uh, a management scheme that really works, for their area. And I think this rural groundwater management area concept, I think does. I'm pretty bullish on it because of the input that you're going to get from the locals and some of the flexibility associated with it. But they do have to come to the reality that if you're gonna manage these aquifers correctly and appropriately, you're going to have to reduce usage until you can find alternative water supplies to help, better manage that bucket without draining it too quickly. And so I don't know if that totally answered your question, Jacob, but I also think that there is growing interest on individual users, you know, measuring their water and sharing that data with the department, but I don't know if they want to share it with the general public.
Okay, that's great. Yeah,
Okay.
that answered the question and then some. That's good. Got a question here from Daisha Hill Hurtado. She asks, is there any collaboration happening between ADWR and the Department of Agriculture on the issue?
Yes. The director of the Department of Agriculture was on the Rural Groundwater Committee. And so we've been working very, very closely with the Department of Agriculture on getting their input and working together with them on, what will work for these rural areas that they represent. I know that Paul is supportive. Paul Brierly, who's the director, is supportive of House Bill 2857. And so, that's a good question. And yes, we have been working together with the Department of Agriculture. Now, there was two people that resigned from the Rural Groundwater Committee, and it was Senator Kerr and also the Arizona Farm Bureau. And during the Rural Groundwater Committee, and this is the first time this has ever happened in my career, I've been on many councils and many committees, and they felt as if they weren't being heard. I think they had an alternative that they felt that wasn't moving forward within the Rural Groundwater Committee. And I can tell you that the other members of the Rural Groundwater Committee, it was unanimous that a couple of the items that were being proposed by Senator Kerr and by the Arizona Farm Bureau, it was unanimous by the other committee members that they didn't necessarily support those objectives. And so they decided to go out on their own, and which is fine. And I totally understand that they did not feel as if what they wanted to move forward was going to move forward within the Rural Groundwater Committee. And so they were some of the primary sponsors and designers of Senate Bill 1221. And so that's where we've seen some conflict with the rural groundwater management area concept. But I think, we're back together again. We're negotiating. I think everyone understands that we need to do something. It's just, what is that something and how do you do it is what's, I think, under debate.
Okay, great. Another question, this one's from Dennis Erickson. Are all of the local cities participating in the Phoenix AMA recharge cost at the GRUSP, the Granite Reef Underground Storage Project? And can you name the cities that are involved in that?
Jacob, you're supposed to know that, man. I retired from SRP. Come on. Well, not all the cities in Phoenix AMA are participating at GRUSP, but the majority of the larger cities are. So you have Gilbert, Glendale, Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe, Scottsdale, Chandler, I think are all at GRUSP. Correct? Jacob?
Sounds right. That sounds right to me.
And Phoenix. Phoenix.
Might have. That's one of those things I need to brush up a little bit more.
And SRP. Now you have some West Side cities that aren't in GRUSP, but they have a alternative recharge site in the West Valley that I think it's Peoria and Avondale are involved in, together with SRP.
And that's the NAUSB?
Yes. Okay. New River Ava Free Underground Storage Project. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, it's Shane DePinto, who also works at SRP. Knows
there you go, Shane. You know.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah. Just thought I'd chime in. Sent a link to one of the GRUSP newsletters, publicly facing, and then there it lists the participants for anyone that's curious. But you covered them, Bruce. It's still locked up in there. You can't get rid of us. It's great to see you, Bruce. Thanks for covering this. This is an important issue, especially when you look at all of the subsidence and drawdown over the state.
Well, thank you, Shane. Good to see you too.
Good to see you. Great, thanks, Shane. Another question, and this is my own question. Some of the things that you brought up that'll be part of this is some routine monitoring and reporting of groundwater use. Do you get the feel that most of the people that'll be, agricultural users or any other type, that might be a challenge for them to keep up on, or just because it's not something that technically they deal with every day or ever? Is that something that's being addressed?
Jacob, any large agricultural farmer out there knows how much he's pumping. It's from a business operations perspective, it's a big cost for them. And so most of those agricultural users, I don't think it's going to be a problem at all for them to report that water use, because they're monitoring those wells. They're monitoring their pumping costs. Like, for instance, someone in Wilcox right now, I think their pumping costs, from what I heard talking to some of the folks in Wilcox, their pumping costs are anywhere from $120 to $150 an acre foot. So you're going to know, and you're going to want to be as efficient as possible when it comes to pumping that water. And that's another, I think that's another component, another piece that I want to raise here is many of these ag users, and again, I'll focus on the Wilcox Basin since I spent some time down there. Many of them are extremely efficient in their water use. I mean, they have center pivots, they're 80-85% efficient. They just have too many holes in the ground. And so it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be an interesting challenge, but I think they know that they might have to take, in order to meet some of these conservation objectives, they might have to change some of the crops they're growing. They might have to take maybe some land out of production. They're going to have to be a little bit more creative, in how they utilize their water supply. But and they recognize they need to do that. But I don't want to give any of you the impression that these guys aren't efficient. They are. It's just that the aquifer is a certain size, and you just got too many straws. You're sucking on that aquifer right now.
Yeah, that's good. And I do have family that are, in what would be considered rural Arizona, and to your point, yes, they are very dialed into what's water's being used, whether it's surface water or groundwater. Just so that's good to know.
Yeah.
Another, is there, and I apologize that I keep asking questions. This is
all right.
something I find very, very interesting. Is there an anticipated, going to what you just said, is there an anticipated effect on the economies of those, whether it's, interstate or international economies that are relying on these agricultural operations?
I can tell you it's our objective not to impact the economy, and hopefully to improve the economy, right? Provide a little bit more certainty and understanding of what the water situation is. Many of those rural groundwater basins are highly dependent on agriculture. So, you have the seed provider, the guy that provides the farming equipment, the guy that works in the field, so they all kind of rely on one another. And they also, many of them, I may grow, say, silage. My silage essentially provides the feed for your dairy cows, right? So they work together too. So they're dependent on one another. So to be honest with you, Jacob, the hope is not to impact the economy, but if anything, kind of stabilize it, make it even more certain, based off of water certainty. Because if you continue to see declines in that aquifer, I would think that uncertainty has impact on future investment in those areas, I would think. And so let's not make, these conservation requirements too draconian, but let's make them workable, but at the same time effective enough that you're essentially, extending the life of that aquifer, making it more sustainable, and continue to work on programs, opportunities in which you can continue to, improve the health of that aquifer. So, maybe it's a little too esoteric from my perspective, but I think if you structure the proper regulatory management scheme together with the locals, and everyone has buy-in, and they're all working together, I think it's a much better situation than where we're at today.
That's great. Appreciate your answers. And I don't mean to come off as grilling you or mostly just trying to understand. Mostly just trying to understand, so that as people ask me or whatever in conversations, I can give them accurate information.
Sure, no problem.
And if there's any other questions, I don't see any others in the chat, or anything else you want to say about this that we haven't covered yet, Bruce.
I don't, just keep updated on the issue. We'll see what happens today in our negotiations, whether we move forward with a piece of legislation that we think the governor can support or not. I can say that something needs to be done. These rural groundwater basins, in particular, those priority basins are not in a good position with the rate of aquifer depletion that we're seeing. And so they need some form of regulatory management that they can support, and at the same time accomplishes some of the goals that need to be accomplished within those basins to maintain the sustainability of those rural areas. So I just ask that you kind of keep up to date on it. And if you have any questions, go to DWR's website, or you can always send me a note.
Well, that sounds great. Again, appreciate your time on this. Wish you the best of luck in those, and that we can get to something like you say that's benefits everybody.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll go ahead and end the presentation. Again, just a reminder, if you are looking to get CECs for your CFM license, to put your name and yes CFM in the chat and prior to leaving. So again, thanks a lot, Bruce. Thanks everybody this morning for being with us this morning, and hope you all have a wonderful day.